Hawthorne. I am a capacity building manager for the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And I'm super excited. I'm going to be the kind of the National Harm Reduction Coalition lead for California Bridge moving forward. My colleague Savannah is also on here, so she was doing. Yep, it's recording right now, Eric. So yeah, you'll be able to get this. I am super excited to be working with y'all for a few different reasons. So prior to moving into my current role, I was managing our San Francisco Training Institute. So I was doing a lot of training with programs in San Francisco, including like a lot of the hospital-based programs as well. And now I'm running all of our statewide training work. So I've joined into handling a lot of the California Bridge work. And then also I am in a master's program right now, a master's of public health program. And the research that I'm working on is actually around culture change, around harm reduction in hospitals. And so this is very relevant to my schoolwork and my research interests as well. I really love doing harm reduction trainings. And so I'm super excited to talk to y'all a little bit today about the war on drugs. And then I'll let Savannah go ahead and introduce herself as well.
I'll keep it brief. You all mostly have Charles today, but I wanted to join. I'm Savannah O'Neill. I've gotten to meet and work with a lot of you in the last couple of years. I'm the Associate Director of Capacity Building for National Harm Reduction Coalition and oversee all of our technical assistance and training work for the state of California. And I am excited to have Charles on our team and taking over a lot of the work that Jen and I have been doing with the California Bridge Project in the last couple of years. And still really excited to be here. And kind of, I might still continue to work with some of you all around statewide advocacy related to buprenorphine or other kind of treatment access initiatives statewide. And so you'll still see me, and really lovely to be here. And I'll pass it back to Charles for the actual content today.
Awesome, thank you. And some folks are still filtering, and so I'm excited to kind of get that. Am I good to go ahead and get started, Elizabeth? All right, let me share my screen.
Yes, please.
All right, can everybody see my slides? Awesome, thank you. So let me go ahead and start the captions. All right, so today I'm going to be doing just a really brief cut down version of a training that I do around a history of drug policy. And we'll be talking a little bit about how this influences your work as medical providers doing work with people who use drugs. So the first thing I would like people to just kind of think about is like, what was your first drug education experience? We're not going to go too deep into this. I think it's just nice to kind of think about, because I know some of the folks that have been in my trainings, they're like, oh yeah, my first experience was being in DARE. Yes, like Alicia said. So being in here and people saying drugs are bad, they're going to kill you. Being told AIDS was being spread through shared needles in the mid-90s. So being really connected to this disease, this like emerging epidemic that was happening. A couple more people saying DARE. Yeah, one of my friends was saying that actually it is like kind of a super strange phenomena that so many harm reductionists won the DARE competition when they were in high school and middle school, like the writing and speaking competitions. It's hilarious to me. Every training I do, it's at least one person. You'll lose your teeth if you use meth. A lot of these things that we hear about drugs that are coming in that are telling us they're bad, they're scary. Ah, yes, thank you, Alicia. Alicia said I totally won. They gave me a DARE sweatshirt. See, it is something that's up, and I think that's really connected because we see what's going on with drugs and the reality of it. And I think when we're young, we kind of see that through a very specific lens. Being told they were bad, they're for losers. All of this really stigmatizing statements and thoughts that are coming up in connection to drug use. And I think where I like to kind of start this framing is recognizing drugs are not new. The way we have talked about them is very new, but drugs in and of themselves are not a new thing. Alcohol has been used dating back over 9,000 years. People drinking alcohol with the intention to get drunk. Hallucinogens were harvested and people used them and found fossils inside of caves where people were storing them, especially in Peru over 10,000 years ago. There's a lot of history of like poppy seeds and opiate traces being found in like plaque and bones in human remains in Italy, dating back 6,000 years. Even when we think about opium in the context of like traditional like Chinese and East Asian medicine, it played a very specific role as far as like pain management and helping people manage anxiety and things like that. Coca leaves, which is the leaf that cocaine comes from, there's evidence of finding these leaves on house floors and human dental remains all the way back to 8,000 years ago. And so people have drugs and especially like plants that have drug-like effects have been really intertwined with human development over the past 10,000 years. This is not a new phenomenon that drugs exist. However, criminalization and regulation is a new phenomenon. And so even back to like less than 200 years, even like less than 200 years ago, they were still selling drugs in pharmacies, like cocaine tooth drops. I don't know how many people on this call have used cocaine, but one of the common reported symptoms that people or side effects of cocaine is it numbs your gums when you put it on your gums. And so people sold cocaine tooth drops because when you put it on your gums, your pain went away and you didn't feel it anymore. Bayer used to sell aspirin with heroin in it, which sounds really effective to me in pain management. And people were used to buy it and use it. And they found it really effective. And people could buy these in pharmacies. People could buy these without prescriptions. You didn't need to go to a doctor. You just had to have somebody sell it to you. So, and that kind of fast forwards us to a few years later, what's happening. So can anybody tell me where the first illicit drug law was passed in the US? Does anybody have an idea? Are you saying something, Eric? The South. Ooh, not. And then Amy said SF. Amy is correct. So the first ever drug law was passed in San Francisco. And it outlawed the smoking of opium. And can anybody tell me what that was connected to?
The Chinese immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, Leslie. Absolutely. It was connected to Chinese immigrants. So Chinese immigrants who were coming into California, working on the railroads, doing a lot of manual labor, often did not bring their wives or families with them. So mostly like Chinese men were also bringing opium with them when they were smoking. They were smoking this in what they would refer to as like opium dens and like in the law, and were often bringing white women in and smoking with them. And people did not like that. They did not like the intermingling of races. They did not like the white women being kind of deflowered. They did not like the fact that these men were making a lot of money and did not have families to support. So they were able to spend their money on this. And so they outlawed the smoking of opium. They did not outlaw injecting it. They did not outlaw eating it. They did not outlaw drinking it in tinctures. They did not outlaw any of that. It was specifically a racialized law. And then we can kind of like fast forward and we have this like Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. And the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was kind of the first time that opium and cocaine were outlawed. And it didn't officially make them illegal, but it basically was saying you have to sell these through these specific means of a pharmacy. And as a pharmacist or a doctor, you have to spend all this money on the taxes. And so most pharmacists were like, I'm not spending that money. And so people couldn't access it anymore, legally at least. And so that's kind of when these laws are first taking place. And these are also very racialized laws because opium and cocaine, both of these at this point, were very connected to Black communities who were using these drugs as well. And then we get up to the 1930s. And that's when marijuana prohibition starts to take hold, especially along like the Mexico border, along California, Arizona, New Mexico, those areas. And this is when a man named Harry Anslinger saunters into the picture. And Harry Anslinger is who we refer to as like the first drug czar. He was the first like DEA head that existed. And here are some select quotes from Harry Anslinger in the 1930s. Reefer makes darkies think that they're as good as white men. And when referring to the people who consume marijuana, says Most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. So we're also seeing a pattern coming up here around white women, which is a whole other lecture that I have that we can talk about if you want, but mostly really related to this racialized lens about what we're thinking about cannabis. They're not saying that it's going to kill you. They're not saying that it's dangerous. They're saying when somebody smokes some weed, they think they're as good as a white man. They're going to go and make some jazz music and dance. This is what they're doing, and that's being seen as anti-culture. This is also when jazz is not super respected. So there's a whole lot of other racialized elements that are coming in here that are being connected to cannabis as a way to outlaw them. Harry Anslinger also recognized that with cannabis, that with cocaine and heroin legal prohibition, at that point, not a lot of people use cocaine or heroin. And so that wasn't really enough to fund his job. They couldn't be like, that didn't justify him getting paid as much as he was paying his whole life. So he went on a tirade to ban all drugs, because that's how you get job security in capitalism, is by creating the problem that you're telling them to pay you to solve. And so then we kind of saunter away. So 1930s, this is happening. We go into the 40s and 50s. There's kind of some more issues popping up. The civil rights movement is starting to gain traction. We're starting to kind of move into this new era. And then Nixon walks into the picture. And when Nixon did his campaign, he very much did it on law and order and controlling drugs and controlling Black people and non-white people in this country. And so he declared the war on drugs. And so his quote he has around the war on drugs is, "To wage an effective war on heroin addiction, we must have international cooperation. In order to secure such cooperation, I am initiating a worldwide escalation in our existing programs for the control of narcotics traffics, and I am proposing a number of new steps for this purpose." And so this is when Nixon is kicking in, what is the war on drugs? This is him kicking in, we are making these things illegal. This is them ramping up these international efforts. So, people having US agents go to other countries, destroy coca crops, destroy crops of opium, having of poppies, like all these different things that are coming up. And really destabilizing other countries, going into neighborhoods and kind of ransacking neighborhoods over drugs. So all of this is being kicked up simultaneously. Which kind of leads us to the question of like, why are some drugs illegal and others are not? And we can talk more about this at any point that you're interested in, because I'm here to support you. But I think for a lot of it, what it kind of boils down to is there's not really a system that you can tell, except for looking at who are using these drugs. And I'm sure as like providers, which y'all know is like a lot of drugs that we give as prescription are pretty similar to drugs that are offered illicitly. So if we talk about something like Adderall, the difference between Adderall and meth is like, it's methylated. There's like one carbon on the chemical structure instead of a hydrogen at one point. That's the only difference between those two chemical structures. It's amphetamine versus methylated amphetamine. And at the, I was a biochemistry major, so I'm a nerd about this stuff. We can talk about that all day too. But the thing is Adderall, you can get with the prescription. Meth, you can't, even though people often report using them for the same purposes, whether that is on or off label. If we talk about something like people using prescription pain meds versus heroin, and we can talk about that in like our current 2020, 2021 context. But when we were going back to like the early 2000s, people thought of those things as very different. And we were passing out, like, these drugs were getting passed out like candy in some communities while being really, really heavily regulated in others. And then we had in 1994, this interview that John Ehrlichman did. John Ehrlichman was President Nixon's assistant for domestic affairs, so handling the domestic affairs in the country. And this is a quote that he did in an interview, in a Harper's Bazaar interview in 94. He said, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this is a person who was paid to do this, admitting this on his deathbed like a coward. That's like a whole other thing. But recognizing that it was never about the drugs. It was never about the harm that the drugs caused. But what it was about is when you take a thing and that is associated with the group and then criminalizing both heavily. And I like kind of naming what that criminalization looks like. Arresting leaders, raiding homes and taking their things, breaking up their meetings so they can't organize, vilifying them night after night on the evening news, so that people who are not part of these communities start to have these thoughts and think about them this way. How about they're not deserving of resources, how it's fine if the FBI are breaking up their homes because they're using crack. And these ideas have proliferated us. When we think about what we saw in those DARE programs, when we think about what we saw when we would watch the news with our parents and we would read the newspaper, what we were taught to think about when we saw somebody being homeless on the side of the road, or when we saw a crack pipe or a needle, all the things that we were taught to think about the people, all the emotions we were taught to have about them. All of those things are manufactured. They are created for us to think that way because people like John Ehrlichman, people like President Nixon had things that they wanted to push for that had they not vilified those communities, they would not have been able to get. So, how do you think these policies impact y'all as medical providers? And I guess this is kind of a piece that we can open it up a bit more. When you're thinking about your work as a provider, how do you think some of this history and these policies influence the way you do your work? And you're welcome to like unmute and talk, or you can type in the chat or whatever.
This comment is probably bigger in scope than it was supposed to be. However, I'm going to say anyways, which is I can't help but think about all of the other systems that are perpetuated that lead to my impression of this question being that mostly it's white people in medicine. A lot of the times it's people who were privileged to begin with, not always, but a lot of times it was, right? You had access to good education, good mentors, good whatever, good parents, good money, whatever, that got you here in the first place. And then, you know, for me as like a white, raised in a Christian household kind of person, where my background was 100%, my parents said, you can always come home unless you're doing drugs. Like if we ever find you doing drugs, we'll kick you out. It's the one reason we'll let you be homeless. It was like the only thing. You could be pregnant, you could do whatever, but if you did drugs, you were out, you know? Yeah. I think that that's common. And so it's sort of like the same population that's being raised with nobody in my house was doing drugs at the time. And like you're in this environment where everyone's adding that stigma. And that's the same group of people who are becoming doctors just based on demographics. I think that you end up finding yourself in an environment where most people around you have a personal history with being raised in that stigma. And so now for me on the flip side on Bridge program, it's really hard to fight it. It's like very hard. It's a giant system of stigma, more than people often will say out loud.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about is that systematic disenfranchising of people, where we have this connection of people of color, specifically like Black people. And I think especially here in California, very specifically around Latinx folks and Indigenous folks, the way they were vilified, separated, the way resources were taken away from them, like actually literally taken away, the way that these systems were built up, and then people who fit into the system continue to be lifted up, and people who do not fell to the wayside. And so, yeah, I think that's a really great point to kind of make of like, when you come and sit into a room that's like mostly white doctors, there's a system that created that. And I think that's a great thing to acknowledge. Thank you, Alicia. Alicia, how do you want me to pronounce your name? I'm sorry.
It's Alicia, but I'm from San Diego. So I've been responding to Alicia my whole life. Either way, it's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Who else? I know other people's minds are spinning. Anyone from the program team want to weigh in, or any Sun mentors?
Well, I was just going to say I'm not a provider, Charles. I'm on the staff, but I always think about what it means for a person of color, particularly African American, to walk into a medical setting and disclose drug use when they have 5 family members who are in jail for drug use, and just why would we expect people to be comfortable doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Serena. So when you think about you doing your work, how does that influence how you're able to provide care or support clients in your work?
I have to run in a few minutes, but I'll comment and say that was a very good presentation. From me as a provider, I think probably for most of us, this is where we get the stigma coming from, because I remember very well the war on drugs and how it pervaded all of society. And now, you have the government trying to convince us now to do a turnaround and say, hey, wait a minute, this is a disease. We need you guys to help us do something about this. So we are still having the ramifications of that misguided, war on drugs. We are still dealing with it right now as providers.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Leslie, because I think there's lots that we can say about like how we used to treat drug use and how we're trying to treat it now. But the truth is those policies are running smack dab into each other and putting us in places where we're recognizing that it's like, yes, there's things that we as providers can do to help people. And here's how our tools are being taken away. And here's how policies are preventing us to doing that. Like, okay, you say this is a disease you want me to treat it as. But when this mom comes in and says she's using drugs and has kids, I still have to report it. So like, what's the truth? What is really going on, and how can we really support people? So that's all I have for now. So thank you so much for engaging with me in that little short conversation. Yeah, and then John had also added, not a provider, but medical providers are also influenced by the biases that are produced by these policies in terms of the care they deliver. So it influences the way people provide care. And Jennifer added, agreed. I was going to say stigmas towards people who use substances are deep rooted. It's hard to change, not just among providers, but admin and policymakers as well. Yeah. And then Tana added, hospital systems also have policies written based on these stigmas. Yeah. That's like a whole other activity I do. Maybe we can do it sometimes, or we can actually look at policies and break it down to the assumptions and stigmas that led to these policies being created.
We would love to do that. Just tell us what Tuesdays you're free. Josh, are you looking to chime in here?
I was just going to say there's another dynamic in healthcare where when someone uses substances, we tend to sort of let ourselves off the hook for even treating that person medically. Like there's this pervasive belief that it's self-inflicted and we're hopeless and we're kind of done here. We're done caring for this patient and we're detaching from the therapeutic relationship once we've identified substance use, particularly substance use that is prevalent in people of color, like those particular choices, heroin, like whatever those. Yeah. So whereas we may not detach our medical care if somebody's using quote unquote acceptable substances that are not as prevalent in people of color.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Josh. That's a great point about how I think that's so real. How good care just goes out the window when we start talking about people who use drugs. I think about so much all these like cash cow treatment programs that have like 10% success rates because they throw out all the people who leave and then say they're fine because and it's like, that's the thing, is like, what does success mean then? How are we judging that? How are we talking about that? And how people don't care when it comes to drug use because there's so much people are just so willing to let people fly let things fly when it comes to somebody who uses drugs, because they might not really care about them getting care about them being supported or being healthy.
Charles, I was wondering if you could speak to your perception of the engagement of people of color in harm reduction services and, I'm going to say, the harm reduction movement, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's looked different over time. It feels really also. I live in Oakland now, and Oakland is kind of like the birthplace of harm reduction in a lot of ways, including one of the longest running harm reduction programs in the country is here, HEPAC, which has always been a Black run program. They're actually on their third Black ED at this point. And it's a really awesome, deeply rooted in harm reduction program that does a lot of awesome services for Black people who use drugs. And there's not a lot of programs that do that at this point. And so I think harm reduction is really inherently something that Black people and people and Latinx folks in the Bay and people of color in general live in their day-to-day lives, because it's kind of a thing of like, it's about staying alive. It's about giving people the support that they need to be healthy. It's about honoring that people have decisions to make for themselves, and we can't tell people what to do as much as we would like to. And I think now what has happened is, as these same processes that that Alicia was talking to and that Josh was kind of talking about come to fruition, people get pushed out. They're not able to do this work anymore because they don't look like the EDs that should get the funding. They don't look like the program that should be supported in this way or should be lifted up. And so they can kind of fall to the wayside. And so I think there's a lot of roles that are necessary, though, because when you don't have those people in the room, there's a lot of things that just don't get talked about. I think it is really fucked up that we are just now kind of looping back to talking about providing crack pipes. That was like one of the first harm reduction interventions, was providing crack pipes. And it was sacrificed in the name of like getting other things through. And really that's something we should have been doing all along. I think it is, yeah. And so I think that's what happens though when you're not including all people that need to be included in conversations there. Because when there's nobody there who can be like, we should probably be giving out crack pipes because we have people who smoke crack, nobody talks about it and it doesn't happen. So I'm not sure if that was like a complete answer, but I think that there's like a really important role that needs to get done. And also, if you're interested, NHRC, one of our communications team, put together a training on Black Future. So it's a kind of like a 20-minute online course that goes through a bunch of videos that Black women in harm reduction recorded about their relationship to harm reduction. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I definitely recommend you take a look at that. It is really, really awesome. And it's really, I think it inspired me, not just in terms of like my heart, but also it really inspired me in my head as well and made me think about some different stuff.
Well, Charles and Savannah, thank you so much. I'm getting a lot. What usually happens right after this meeting is my Slack messages and texts fill with response from people, and I'm getting a lot of positive and can he come back, and we love this. So thank you very much. Much appreciated. And for the clinicians on this call, I think and actually everybody on this call, the ongoing question is to think about how some of these concepts that Charles has shared with us today fit in with that equity work plan that we've developed and the new statement about drug possession that I'll be sharing with you all later this week. So just thinking about how this turns into one big body of work that impacts the future of the work that we are doing in California and nationally. So thank you so much. We definitely will be talking to you more soon. For those of you who joined this call, pretty please keep up your excellent attendance and join next week. We're going to be talking about an interesting and potentially kind of controversial situation that happened between two Bay Area hospitals where a patient was turned away for treatment, ended up at another hospital. And we're going to be talking about how we want to be handling reports of patients being turned away from hospitals that are receiving funding to have sons. So big question, big topic to think about. Please join next week. Charles and Savannah, I'm really grateful to know both of you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Sharam, Amy, and John, we can just hang out here until people log off to get started. Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Y'all are rad. Every single